Well, welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for what we know is going to be a fabulous conversation with someone who I've admired for a very long time, Dan Porterfield, the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, with a storied career before coming to that great institution. We're going to be talking with him about activating lifelong growth, something that you know is core to everything we believe in here at the Graham School, the home of lifelong learning for the University of Chicago. Before jumping into our conversation with Dan, I'll just preview that we have many other great conversations in the months ahead. We have a conversation with Roosevelt Montas from Columbia on why great books matter. We have a discussion with our own Graham School instructor, Lynn Apnip, about her new book on the American literature and how you can go from tragedy to apocalypse. And then at the end of this month, we'll talk, continuing a lot of what we're going to talk about today, about how this idea of mental agility and wellness can apply in a regional sense to longevity hubs with two leaders from MIT's Age Lab. And I will also just give this quick reminder that we are at the moment where spring registration is open. And so hopefully today will only inspire you further that you want learning in your journey. And so in the chat, Marina will put in the link for those of you who want to see what's on our spring catalog. But the reason that you are all here is to hear from Dan Porterfield. Dan, it's wonderful to welcome you virtually to the University of Chicago, a place you know very well, given your many partnerships with us.
Thank you.
I'll introduce Dan, who has an extraordinary bio with just a few of his biographical features, because I could be here for the entire time talking about all of his accomplishments. Since 2018, he has been president and CEO of Aspen, a global nonprofit founded in 1949 to ignite human potential, to build understanding, and create new possibilities for a better world. It is an institute that has a lot in common with the University of Chicago because many of the people involved in its early days were also deeply involved here at the University of Chicago. People like Mortimer Adler, who all of you in our Great Books program know has been a central figure in the liberal arts and society universe. Prior to leading Aspen Institute, Porterfield served for 7 years as the president of Franklin and Marshall College, something that he draws a lot on in the book that we're going to be talking about, Mindset Matters. Before assuming that presidency, he served as senior vice president for strategic development and an award-winning professor of English at Georgetown University, his alma mater. And prior to going to Georgetown, he was the chief speechwriter for the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services in the government. So he's had a career that has spanned across many forms of service, and he has seen into the liberal arts from many different vantage points. And his latest book, Mindset Matters, looks at the question of how people develop a growth mindset, and in particular, locates that focus within residential colleges and his own Franklin and Marshall College. And so with that as the very big focus, I want to start there, Dan, as we begin to look at the book. And what we're going to do in this conversation is we're going to start with the book, which is more focused on that undergraduate moment, but then we're going to quickly broaden out because we know our audience includes a lot of lifelong learners, and we're going to talk about how ideas from this book apply across all ages and stages of life. But let's start with defining growth mindset, which is such a core concept. What is it and why does it matter?
So some of you no doubt are familiar with the research of the Stanford psychologist, Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, maybe about 20 years ago now, that gave expression to the idea that is when we are encountering new opportunities, new challenges, moments for learning, for pushing ourselves, for venturing into new terrain, we may take one of two approaches to that invitation. And the one approach would be to look at it and say, I can do this. My skills are malleable. I can grow. I can learn. I can meet the moment. Maybe the moment is learning Chinese, or maybe the moment is supervising a group of colleagues who do work that you haven't done before. Or maybe the moment is to have to learn a different kind of skill in math or in science. But you get that invitation to do something new, hard, maybe even a little threatening, you say, I can do it. I grow. I'm a grower. The other mindset is the fixed mindset, which is the mindset that says, when confronted with the new, I'm not good at that. I can only do things I'm good at. If I know I'm good at it, I'll do it. If I'm not necessarily that good because my ability just isn't in that area, I'm going to stay away from it. I'm not good at Chinese. I don't do languages well. Or those characters are so intricate. I could never learn that. Or supervise somebody that's done work that I haven't done. That's too stressful. I don't want that. Um, and the idea of a fixed mindset is that really we almost want to protect ourselves from being exposed at not good at something. And so we don't even take the effort. Um, Somebody looking at the chance to take Chinese might say, this is a language of the world. This is a chance for me to meet people and work with them in all kinds of ways that can only happen if I do it. And I got this. It'll take effort. I'll probably stumble, but I'm going to go after it. And so I believe the growth mindset is really another way of describing that one of the highest ideals of our learning communities, no matter who they serve, preschool through the PhD into lifelong learning and adult education. The question is, can we equip and encourage and empower people to keep growing, to keep striving, to be able to always find the next horizon of opportunity? And for me personally, that idea of a growth mindset was something that I lived in the way I was raised, and especially in my education at Georgetown from Jesuits and other faculty who had this deep conviction that every student, you start with where they are and help them move to where they can go. And so that I benefited from that because I was encouraged and equipped to take on intellectual challenges or other kinds of challenges. And so when I read Carol's book 20 years ago and was teaching at Georgetown, it gave a vocabulary for what I had lived myself and had tried to do for my students. I love that the University of Chicago is trying to do that for adult learners. It's incredibly inspiring to me.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's a very incredible body of literature, as you mentioned, that has now come to show that those with a growth mindset are able to accomplish and to engage new pursuits at a much greater level than that fixed mindset. And particularly as we think about young people and their development, it is this critical tool. And often it's not taught, at least in that traditional K to 12 test-based classroom.
No,
And so,
I happen to look at the chat, and Carol put a comment in already, and I won't keep up with the chat perfectly, but asking about teachers with a fixed mindset. You're absolutely right, Carol. Often we learn that our capabilities are capped from how we are taught and educated. I couldn't agree more with the implication of your question.
well, so it's a perfect segue, Dan, because I do want to start at the younger stage. And again, we're going to come
Yeah.
to people across all ages and stages. But your book really is centered around this residential college experience. And I want to just put the context out there that we are in a moment for liberal arts colleges in particular and residential universities more broadly, where there is a big question about value and about return to education. There's a real belief among some that online education can replace that potentially formative experience. And so you're writing about how residential colleges might be able to play a unique role in fostering this growth mindset at a time where there is a real question about, is it actually valuable to be in that setting, especially valuable consistent with the cost that it might burden a family. And so really eager for you to just dig into kind of how might a residential college experience be structured to be able to foster a growth mindset in potentially a greater way than even other interventions.
Okay, so let me start by saying something that about how I think it forms. How do we develop a growth mindset? And it's some people think it's just exhorting people like, oh, you can learn, you can do more, you got this. I only think that's a little part of it. It actually, growth mindsets come out of our own actions and agency. So think of it this way: we learn, but not only do we learn, we know we learned. That's why grading and measurement and assessment is very important. We learn, we know we learned, we know how to learn again. And with that combination, repeat it again and again. Learn, know you learn, know how to learn. The identity moment is to say, I'm a learner.
Yeah.
And that's the key, that internal belief that I can drive my own development. Now, I believe that belief can be fostered through many kinds of learning and through work. I think community colleges, I think early education, I think vocational training, I think advanced learning, all different kinds, I think workplace learning, I think all of it can foster growth mindsets. I wrote about the residential liberal arts college and university, like University of Chicago and Franklin and Marshall and Georgetown, because that was where my direct experience was. And I wanted to share what I witnessed almost like an ethnographer who was in the community, assessing and carefully noting what was happening by the people in the community. And so I told about 40 stories in the book of students that I knew well, had seen them throughout their college journey. I was pretty hands-on in my role as a teacher and president, and I was able to capture their experience in ways they gave me permission to show how that mindset for growth took hold in them. And I think there is a distinctive value proposition for college, for residential college, in fostering growth mindsets, because it's a 24/7 learning community.
Yeah.
In its best, with many adults engaging with younger people who are looking for engagement, with many different kinds of teams, class as team, residential community as team, club as team, sports team as team, with a great deal of mentoring happening all the time. It's like the soft power of a school is the way people acculturate one another to what's going on. And with a logic in our residential colleges 24/7 of aspiration, of growth, of go somewhere, of do something, of learn, of go deeper. And so I think it can be, at its best, a really beautiful, constantly sort of individual focused, community focused environment for facilitating the idea that we're here to grow. We're here to grow together and help each other grow. Doesn't mean everything's perfect, but there's so many critiques of college today saying, it's just a woke factory. Or no, and actually it's the opposite. It excludes everybody who the colleges weren't made for 100 years ago. Or, no, it's not that. It's that they're just partying all the time. College is the extended adolescence, with too much alcohol. Or, no, it's not that. It's actually too conformist. Everybody's going to work for the same few consultancies and banks and things. And I think all of those critiques should be attended to. They should be attended to. But we also, to use a cliche, should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Millions of students a year are able to complete their college education with a deeper confidence that they have the ability to lead their learning in the future. And let's double down on that. Now, University of Chicago is pretty much the ideal place because it's so focused and so committed to the idea of intellectual growth towards independence of mind and freedom of thought. That's exactly one of the main assets of the residential college experience, along with some other ones that I write about.
Well, so before we jump into applying this across life, last question on the residential colleges, because you named it, there is this real possibility of how it can foster that kind of growth. And everything you said spoke to my own experience. I found college to be transformative. I think about the chance in the student orgs I was a part of to do things I could have never imagined doing. Some of them failed, but by the end of college, enough had gone well that I had grown in confidence. I believed I could do things that I don't think I would have ever believed, and that made me, silly in a great way, that I put myself out there in ways I never would have, right? But for the fact that,
Exactly.
I built up this sense, oh, I can do that because, I did it in this little microcosm, and now I'm going out into the world. So I'm a total believer. At the same time, you and I are reading the same data. We're seeing some of the same issues. We are not fully there in higher education, and there is a real spectrum in terms of, some producing those kinds of outcomes and others having the burden of a residential experience, but not really moving the needle either from the academic rigor or potentially the behavioral, like growth mindset perspective. Where do you see the biggest gaps today in the difference between your vision and where we are net large in residential higher education? How do we close some of those gaps?
So I'll say this to everybody on the Zoom. If you happen to glance at this book, you could go to there. I identify 5 manifestations of the growth mindset: the mindset to discover, to create, to collaborate, to give and receive mentorship, and to strive to pursue learning because of what you value most.
Hmm.
And I believe that those particular versions of the growth mindset, discovery, creating, teamwork, mentorship, and values-driven striving, is critical for today's rapidly changing world. The pace of change, tech-fueled, science-fueled, is exponential. And that young people and old people, all people, are going to have to be able to sort of be the authors of our own education and work, because everybody's job is going to change, because society, how we get information is changing. How do we validate good and bad information? How do we find ways to work in teams together to sort of enact the power of we? How do we learn on the job from what? From mentors. How do we feel a sense of purpose in a world where purpose is being, sort of like almost a crisis of purpose among so many? And so I believe that these assets, if you will, or aspects of the growth mindset are more valuable today, even because of the pace of change, than in years past. So I really want to call on colleges to care about believing our mission with 18 to 23-year-olds especially, but with everybody, is to help them leave the experience ready to grow and grow and grow, and believing that's their identity. They've done it, they want to do it more. So what changes would be helpful then to achieve that vision? To me, there's a couple, and I'll say them quickly, but one would be even more time with faculty. This is not a University of Chicago problem, but at many institutions, the classes are large, TAs are doing a lot of the interacting, professors are sages on the stage. In all the stories I tell of these mindsets, faculty are part and a partner of the students' learning. Secondly, as implied by the question, more research that shows faculty how to foster growth mindsets and why a fixed mindset is capping student potential in a way that is perhaps unfair. A third thing I would think would be valuable, that would be, and these 2 things are achievable, what I just said. A third thing would be admissions practices that look to identify students who have a yearning to grow as a credential. Because if more students have a critical mass of students in our schools are yearning, are passionate, have proven that they are growth-oriented, that sets a norm in the student body that's really valuable. And then one last thing for now, I would say, is making sure that we think about how to perhaps create a new transcript that allows students to document their learning at work, in residential community, in clubs and activities, and it teases out of the college experience more of the growth that students are pushing themselves for than the transcript alone is able to document. In fact, the transcript barely documents intellectual growth. It records what a grade was. I'm not against, in fact, I love grades, but I want to help students be much more purposeful in building their growth trajectories.
Well, I'll just say, as we close this piece of the conversation, Dan, that there's a piece by David Brooks in the Atlantic last month about how the Ivies broke America, but the content in there is about this challenge of building holistic and morally formative educational institutions. And a lot of the end recommendations align closely, and David is an incredible resource that we share across our institutions. So I didn't want to miss the chance to reference his piece, which I imagine you saw as well.
Yeah, I also want to call out two people that have University of Chicago connections. And by the way, I've got many friends in Chicago. Our board chair of the Aspen Institute, Margot Pritzker, is and Tom Pritzker are long involved with the University of Chicago. They're incredible people. But one is Carol Quillen, is the former president of Davidson College, and now the head of the Trust for Historic Preservation, a University of Chicago undergrad and David's classmate. And Carol read this book in draft and is quoted later in it. And I think her University of Chicago education definitely launched her as a lifelong learner and thinker and creator. And then secondly, there's a professor I've never met in philosophy named Agnes Callard. And she wrote a book called Inspiration, no, sorry, called Aspiration, that I read that was really fantastic. Someday I hope to meet her. And that I quote her a couple times in my book.
Well, she has another book coming out this year, Open Socrates, A Philosophical Life. So I'll just put that in there. Let's move now to where many of our learners are in midlife. And you are an institution that has been an incredible partner in the Leadership and Society Institute here, but also you have many programs from the Festival of Ideas to your fellowships that are engaging people in midlife. Dan, as you think about this question of how you learn and develop your growth mindset in midlife, I'm curious, how do you think that takes place when we're thinking about lifelong learning, in your 50s and 60s? How do you cultivate this mindset? What are the opportunities and challenges potentially at this stage?
By the way, Carol asked if I would put the 5 manifestations in a chat. So I put in a chat a link to a Fast Company article, Carol, that goes through the 5 manifestations, and it's sort of like the Cliff Notes, a short version that will give you, I think, a good feel for it. So I think that the whole idea of the Graham School of challenging ourselves is a critical component of having a growth mindset. And how do we create intentional communities where people are supporting each other, taking the risk of continued growth, midlife or after retirement? Coming together to learn together, to take classes at University of Chicago, to read works that others are recommending, that open-minded, inquiring spirit is, I think, a big thing. And a second thing I think is really valuable for we who are older is to spend a lot of time with people who are younger, and to both give back and give and get from. One of our greatest board members at the Aspen Institute, Madeleine Albright, who had this legendary quote, which was, "The older I become, the younger my mentors become." And I think that's a really great philosophy. Let's partner with young people to learn from them, to see the world through their eyes. It's an incredibly easy way to learn, and you're also helping them. And then I think also that being in a context where we're looking to make a new contribution to something we value, a school, the world, faith community, a nonprofit, being part of some change move of some type, where you're, like as Dr. King said, we put our minds and bodies in motion for change. So aligning with something that speaks to your values, it's about change. I think that's a third way. So being with young people, constantly reading and reinforcing each other as a learning community and dialogue, and then finding causes to work on.
So I want to ask one more macro question, then we're going to come to the questions that are already populating the chat. So any others, please put them in, we'll get to them. Talk about where you think we are in society, Dan, and what you see as some of the big challenges that might be roadblocking growth mindset development. Because you talked about that in the context of the residential experience, the good, but also where some of those roadblocks are. You work a lot on these big questions in society as Aspen Institute. You're working on issues where I think you see these fixed mindsets. What are some of those forces that you see net large that might be holding us back from realizing this goal?
We were founded in 1949 in the aftermath of the Holocaust, World War II, the use of nuclear weapons, the beginning of further Soviet expansion, the rise of communism in China. It was a scary time, a dangerous time. And the people that founded the Aspen Institute, many from Chicago, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the former legendary president, and Walter Pepke, and Mortimer Adler, they believed it was possible to bring adults together for if you will, around a table for a discussion that centered on values and allowed people to both learn from great texts, learn from each other, and learn from their own experience. And that habit, if you will, of reflection and contemplation, they thought was critical to protecting society and civilization with all those other threats. They were worried about technology too, back then, the technologies of war in particular, but also of industrialization. And in some ways, we're at the same moment where there's rapid technological change that has the potential to alienate people from their own lives and jobs. There's polarization, which makes us think we don't have to engage with somebody who's different than us. That's a fixed mindset by definition. There's also, I think, the danger of information overload that causes us to shut down and say, how can I take more in? So those are just, three factors. How to overcome that, I believe, is sort of, first of all, is to reject cynicism. We just say, whatever else is in the world, whatever else people think, I am going to try to keep learning from others, make my contribution to the world, and inspire others to believe they can make a contribution. And doing that, I think, is the agency implied in that, which is the antidote to cynicism, is also a way to foster growth mindsets. But these are powerful societal trends, no doubt. That said, what choice do we have but to try to combat them?
Well, so I'm going to come now to the questions from our audience. And the first one comes from an LSI fellow, Alice Davison, who writes, what do you assign to failure in developing a growth mindset, and how do colleges encourage or support that?
Oh, I love that question. I love it so much. So remember, I was a teacher at Georgetown for a number of years. I lived in residence hall with my family for 8 years. Then I went to Franklin and Marshall as president, where I also taught. And failure and setback are essential to developing growth mindsets. In fact, again, if we're thinking of ourselves as parents or grandparents, we can't protect our young people from having setbacks and difficulty. Difficulty can be desirable if we're in a constructive mode to learn so that we can then raise our game. I think you almost have to have setback. Now, my stories that I tell in this book, roughly 4 stories per chapter. There's 7 chapters, 5 mindsets. Almost all of the stories are about individual students, undergraduates, who face the difficulty of feeling like they don't belong, imposter syndrome, familiar concept, of a setback academically. One of them has intense shyness and can barely talk to other people at the beginning of her career. A couple lose parents during the course of their college years, the enormous setback, freezes in so many ways, the fog of grief. They have to get through it. Some came to college with invisible disabilities that they only began to attend to, having achieved college. They held their breath before. It was a feeling of restlessness, of wanting to make something, do something. How can I do something? So these difficulties, whether they're academic, social, emotional, kind of experiential, they are the best friend of growth mindsets. And that's why I think faculty and other mentors are so important, because if young people trust that they're in a place that sees and values them, they can take the risk of growth to go through these, if you will, corridors of difficulty to come out on the other side better equipped to then create their learning going forward. And I really strongly believe that all of you who are in this program, who have young people in your terrain, including possibly in some way students at University of Chicago, that helping young people feel seen and valued and being a mentor, unobtrusive but present as they deal with a difficulty, is a gift for them of their future.
So we have a question here about how educational institutions make a practical argument for the ability to learn,
Yeah.
meaning that instead of the argument, I'm going to get your kid an immediate job in this high-paying field, we're going to use these 4 years to really build the core assets of an intellectual mindset so that then for the rest of your life, you can use that to constantly take in new information. And to your point about a rapidly changing world, you can thrive in that world. How do you think we do it? Because right now, I'll say as someone who just observes where parents are as my own kids are, aging up into high school and hearing them talk about how, they want their kids to do computer science, and computer science is great if that's what your kids want to do, to be clear. But, I also think it's great if they want to learn the humanities. And for me, like I see that being in higher ed, like I just want my kids to learn how to learn. That's my big goal for them in college. But that's not where I think society at large is. And your point is there's a lot of data to suggest learning for learning is really valuable in a rapidly changing world. How do we change that narrative? How do we make that case?
So I think that the question implies the answer here, that a great education equips you to have the agility to keep learning both as the world changes, but also as opportunities for promotion occur.
Yeah.
And I like to say to students at Franklin and Marshall and Georgetown, so University of Chicago too, your undergraduate education will be least valuable in your life in your first job. It will be most valuable every time your job becomes more complex. Every time you have to work with more people with different skills to achieve something together. Every time your work is disrupted by some outside force. Every time you have to manage more people. That University of Chicago degree, with the suppleness of mind, the ability to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of false versus true, with the ability to know how to dig deep to get knowledge, becomes more valuable. I think that is actually our best practical argument. And I value that argument. I don't want to say, oh no, college is only intrinsically meaningful. If you have an instrumental reason to go to college, that's lesser. I disagree with that. I think an instrumental reason is awesome if that's what motivates you. And just remember, the instrumentality of lifelong learning is even better than the instrumentality of a single skill that may be rendered obsolete.
Well, I'll just say that it's so interesting that you describe it that way, Dan, because if you look at our ranking systems and rating systems right now, almost all of them are set up to say, how does your education prepare you for your first job? Right? And so it really is a challenge if that is the value between where that value is developed and the long-term
Yeah.
nature of it, and then where we are in terms of understanding that value. And it certainly, I think, in our particular context in the liberal arts, sets back the humanities in terms of maybe the real value
Yeah.
that they
I
can
think what you're
the world.
doing, Seth, you're in creating opportunities for adult learning, you're showing the way forward. Our schools have to be relevant to people on their continuing learning journey. And the idea of 4 years and done is just not realistic. There's some great questions, by the way. I can't even see them all. But this idea that Peter raises about growth mindsets fostered through mundane challenges like printer problems and word processing, absolutely. Absolutely. Solving mundane little problems is the pathway. And I think and we value certain kinds of true professionals who know how to handle the little things that make something big is a big deal. I love that. And I also love the question Janice asked about how do you teach, let's say foster for a moment, or activate a growth mindset to someone who's got an entrenched fixed mindset? That is a really great question. My answer, Janice, to that, it comes out of my experiences. It's about engaging in relationship. I'll speak as a faculty member with our students. I want to have a relationship with every student I teach such that they both feel that they know I'm equipping them to be a lifelong learner. They believe that I tell them that. And then secondly, I'm available to them to come back after the formal class if there's something else that they want to work through or compete to prepare themselves to do. I really think relationships are, are central here. I also think that challenging people and not accommodating people, so you accommodate a fixed mindset, better to challenge, but challenge by rolling up the sleeves and helping them see the pathway to learning. That was that third step I mentioned. You learn, you know you've learned, so document their learning. Teach, document, and then show them how they can do it. And if they take away this idea that I can do it, that's a good shot at a breakthrough. Of
We have
course,
a
I'm
related
optimistic. By the way, I'm optimistic. I should be. Any professor who's not optimistic about student capability is almost by definition not giving the students the chance to get the best that professor has to offer.
A related question, Dan, comes from another LSI fellow, Anthony Martinez, who asked about habits to nurture a growth mindset. And so you're already going through a couple of those in your answer here. Are there other habits? Can, for example, I've seen this elsewhere, journaling and reflection, and those pieces help people to kind of hardwire. Are there ways almost from
Yeah.
a cognitive restructuring standpoint that you've seen people with their own individual habits try to practice different, approaches that help
Yeah.
them to grow in this way?
Yeah, I'll give three fast examples from the book. Morgan Kincaid is a student I describe as a discoverer, and she's the one that started So Shy She Couldn't Talk. And so in class, she felt terrible anxiety and shame because the conversation was moving fast, and she was thinking at a fast level, but she couldn't get it out. All the classes at F&M are small, like Chicago. They're all rich and intense right out of the box. So she went to see the professor. She was just upset. And the professor chose to see her every couple days in her office in the late afternoon light and just talk. Just talk. And that process of just talking, of just having a meaningful conversation, brought Morgan more comfort so she could start to try it in class. And the fast version of this is that so the discipline was, the practice was talking. She later went on study abroad and journaled and made her journals publicly available to her friends and family. I read some of them. And so again, she was talking. Morgan Kincaid ended up as the valedictorian of Franklin and Marshall. She spoke at graduation. It's a perfect sort of story of how the optimistic effort to try expressed itself in a practice which led to that growth. A second story is Carolina Giraldo, who came with a deep sense of readiness to grow at Franklin and Marshall. Her family were immigrants from Colombia. They fled the narco wars. The parents gave up everything to save their kids. They moved to Miami, and they had a hard scrabble life, but everybody was about education. Carolina was the first to go to college. She came to Franklin and Marshall, pre-med student. She also rode, and she was open to all learning. And she suffered a terrible tragedy, like life gives all of us eventually, and that her father died at the end of her freshman year. And so the father was her hero. That's why they were in the country. That's why she adopted a growth mindset. That's why she believed in learning, and suddenly her hero was gone. Her little brother was about 5 years younger than her. Her mom were in Miami. I thought Carolina might not come back for sophomore year. She might go to the University of Miami. But Carolina's mom called me and said, Carolina's coming back. She has to come back. This is what she must do. So I want to say that the practice of reinforcing one another is really important. And then when Carolina got here, the third story, when she came back sophomore year, she was hurting. And it was hard to study. It was hard to feel that everyday stuff was meaningful. Of course it was. She knew it, but she was in pain. So she decided to pick up art, to use her brain differently. And she went to the art department to see if she could take a drawing class. There was a drawing class, but it met at the same time as her chem labs. The professor said to her, I'll teach you on Saturdays. And so she became a student who could draw, first drawing and then painting over 3 years. 1 year, her work of drawing, it was It was Michelangelo, the David. It was a drawing of his eye, just his eye.
Huh.
Won the award for best drawing that year. So what am I getting at? First of all, this professor is a moral giant. I don't know if he even knew that she was suffering grief. But the idea that the faculty are there for the students, that's why we're here. So powerful. And then, but for her, it was using a new part of her brain, the practice of trying to just work in a different way. Maybe it was somebody else, it would be dance, especially those recovering from physical trauma, for example. Or maybe it would be going deeper on research about the socioeconomic conditions that frustrate them in their lives, which is what Charisma Lambert did. So frustrated about entrenched racism and poverty that she began to study it passionately. By the way, she's getting her master's in public policy from University of Chicago this spring.
Ah,
So you're really right to ask, what are the practices? And I've mentioned a couple, but it's everyday practices, but doing them earnestly.
we have time for one more question, and I want to come to Geneva Norman's question. How do we make these concepts available to those who might have physical or economic limitations? And I know you address some of that in the book. Obviously, some of these students who come to Franklin and Marshall have that, but it's still a high resource environment like the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
How have you thought about this question of how we bring these powerful and important concepts, fully to the world?
So one answer is I'm hopeful that AI, which can personalize learning, will continue to advance, and that it may be possible also for learners who cannot access physical communities in time to be able to go through sort of like the metasphere to be able to interact with one another. We'll see how that unfolds. We should be open to that, though. And then the other concept to make available, or the other thing I want to say, I've taught in prisons. I've taught recently arrived immigrants fleeing terrible trauma in Latin America. I've taught court supervised youth. I did that before I got into higher ed. And then I worked with a lot of first gen college students at Georgetown and Franklin and Marshall, including types that have experienced generational poverty. Students at F&M, some had really survived very difficult global traumas. We had a student who's in the book who was abducted by Joseph Kone. We had students that survived their families' genocide in Bosnia. There's a lot to talk about here about these really giant difficulties. And each one has its own, I want to say, eminence and should be valued. I think that however we can do it, helping each person believe that they have the power to create the learning they seek, however that might happen, and trying our best to make that possible through physical spaces, through virtual spaces, but above all from this idea that we believe in one another and will help people create their education, create their learning. Opening story in the book is about Julia Ramsey, who had a 7-year journey to her degree because she suffered a almost catastrophic disability and could not leave her house for 2 years. Her family stayed with her. She had no energy. She couldn't study, but she learned from a doctor, try to improve in 20 areas of your life, but just 5%. And he helped her see that her willpower was her greatest asset. So I don't want to minimize that, even when circumstances are tough, because helping people unlock their ability, our ability to drive our development is ultimately such a gift. So anyway, if you read the book, the last chapter covers 3 students. One who grew up in a workers' factory in Saudi Arabia. He was from Bangladesh, came to America, single mom, put himself through high school, went to F&M. The second, a student who lived in a place so segregated that black and white never interacted. And she constantly turned down opportunity to be the one black student in honors classes because it seemed so unfair to her. She ended up at F&M. And the third student comes from deep, deep, deep rural Pennsylvania was an hour away from his high school. No one in his family had ever gone to college. None of those students, Akbar, Markira, Sheldon, had family members went to college. In their schools, almost no one went to college. They all had one person, not always associated with the school, that inspired them to believe they could go to Franklin and Marshall College. And we had a full need financial aid program, just like University of Chicago. Those three students became themselves, made themselves in college. Today, Markira is a clinical psychologist working with school children. Sheldon is a diplomat in the United States Foreign Service stationed in Africa. And Akbar has a Penn Law degree and is the chief policy advisor to the governor of Pennsylvania. I say this to say they did not have any material advantages. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have help, but they also, with their own agency and help, especially a good financial aid program that met their needs, they're now able to enrich our society as a diplomat, a psychologist, and a policymaker. That's the vision I see for higher education, and University of Chicago expresses that as powerfully as any institution in the country.
Well, and it's a very inspiring vision. And I'll just close, Dan, by saying that as you've described, role modeling is such a core part of helping others to develop a growth mindset. You are truly an aspirational role model. We didn't get into your own personal story, but it is another example of this growth mindset and being able to overcome so that you can embrace this incredible opportunity and contribute so valuably. Thank you for what you've written in this book. Thank you for your leadership at Aspen. Thank you for being such a great partner in our work. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you as we all continue our growth. And you're given the last word here.
There you go. My last word is two things. One is the chat is bouncing. It looks like it's like popcorn. It looks so great. I think it might be possible for Seth to give me the chat, but
Yes, I will give it to you.
If you want to email me, it's daniel.porterfield, I go by Dan, at one long word, aspeninstitute.org. And I'll definitely write back. And then secondly, writing this book so that I could capture what I experienced and perceived and honor the experiences of my students and the faculty that helped them and the other educators and their parents is incredibly personally meaningful to me. And just to me, but I want to encourage all of you to think about what story you want to tell, what insight you've learned, what you've lived that you want to share with others, because each of us has something to offer with our voices that way too. And I feel really lucky to have been able to have this conversation with you because I was able to write something that came out of my heart and my mind, and I want everyone to experience that. So thank you, Seth.
Well, and I'll just say, Dan, because we both share the great books tradition, it's Aristotle who said, you look at the stories of a person's life and you know what that person valued. And so very fitting that you have these stories, a sign of what you value, a beautiful thing. Thank you again. Thank you all for joining us.
All right.
Have a wonderful afternoon all.
Bye, everybody.